Hello, everybody. My name is Stella. Welcome to episode 5 of the Mercuranians Podcast. It is currently 1:17 p.m., Monday, April 11th. How are you doing today, Cam?
I'm doing good. I'm ready to talk about Sect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, this episode's not going to be quite as delineation based or archetype based. This one's going to be a little bit more technique.
Yeah, I mean there's going to be just some general discussions about kind of the nature of the planets, and it's going to kind of summarize couple of points that we've talked about in some of the planet episodes. So we'll talk a bit about qualities we've mentioned and kind of summarize it all and have a discussion, I guess, about how it contributes to the concept of sect in traditional astrology, which is um, really an important, really a really important gateway into looking at just how the different planetary interactions are affecting the chart. All right. Well, do you want to get us started talking about the basics here?
Yeah, definitely. So, sect is going to be the difference between day and night, whether it's going to be in a chart or when you're talking about teams of planets in the chart. So, the sun is going to determine the sect, whether you are a day or a night chart, and the sun is going to be the diurnal sect leader, whereas the moon is going to be the nocturnal sect leader. So, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I just said yeah, like basically sect is just another name for team, really. That's how I.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And throughout the episode, I'm sure you'll hear us both referring to them as like the day team, the night team, diurnal, nocturnal team.
Mhm.
Um, on the diurnal team, there is going to be the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then on the nocturnal team, we're going to have the Moon, Venus, and Mars.
Yep. So it's basically like thinking about two different political factions kind of working against each other, and one of them, just like in real life, is kind of going to be in charge, and the other one's kind of going to be battling for power in a way, and so or potentially creating problems. So it's going to be important to understand which planets are like on your team or working for you or working in your favor versus planets that are essentially working harder to help manifest positive outcomes for you.
Right. You could also imagine the team that is not in power. So the one that does have the power is going to be whatever sect your chart is. The team that's not in power could be speaking a different language and trying so hard to communicate what they want with the rest of the chart, but it's just not being heard, it's not being
Mhm.
received, and vice versa.
Yeah,
And
I really love what you just said about like it's a different language because it's like in so many ways, and we'll talk about like all the different qualifications that kind of separate them in these groups. There's so much of like this notion between the nature of the planets, and similar nature allows them to communicate or be like-minded in a way, and that can give them a sympathy to connecting with each other. But when we're talking about planets on different sects or on different teams, um, they have a much more difficult time interacting with each other. There's like another effort that you have to make, or that has to be made for those planets to communicate. So when we start looking at, I mean, the myriad of other things in astrology for assessing planetary condition, the first layer is always going to kind of come back to looking at the sect of the planets and this basic idea of, is it with the team in favor or is it on the other team?
yeah, exactly. And kind of tying in what you said about politics earlier, if you imagine, let's say you're a Democrat and you're a room full of Democrats, and somebody makes a comment about, I don't know, healthcare. there's going to be a lot more like agreement, and you can assume that that's just going to kind of be understood and what you mean and what you say, and people are going to be on the same page. If you have a room that's full of mixed political parties, as the natal chart is, where we have different sects of planets in the one chart, and you say, hey, how does everybody feel about free healthcare? You're going to have some dissonance there. There's going to be disagreement. There's going to be a lot of different viewpoints and different energies and attitudes towards it. And so that can be that same kind of energy here, where it's like, we all understand what's happening at hand here, but like, what are we doing with it? How are we treating it? What is going to be the consequence of this action or event?
Mm-hmm. And it's like, I think it's so important to look at, because it's like, as you said, what's the consequence? Sect is really going to show you in a lot of ways, like the final outcome of a matter that you're kind of analyzing in the chart. So if it comes down to, looking at the details of something and it's not really clarifying it, often, most of the time, you can just look at the sect of the planet. So when we talk about, houses and the topics of your life that these planets are going to be ruling, we have to understand that just at the base level, these planets are either working to manifest those things in a positive way or not. And so Sect is going to allow you to see the baseline. Like I said, it's going to be give you that basic outcome. So there's a lot of minute factors that could, affect that in some ways, but at the base level, this is really the ultimate consideration to take into account.
Yeah, definitely. So if you are looking at a natal chart wheel and you're like, how can I see the sect of this chart? It's going to be, is the sun above or below the ascendant descendant axis?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's anywhere in houses 7 to 12 in that upper half of the chart, it's going to be a day chart. If the sun is below the ascendant descendant axis, anywhere in houses 1 through 6, then it's going to be a night chart. But again, when it comes to houses 1 and 7, it gets a little bit muddy if your sun is in either of those houses, just because it depends on whether the sun is going to be above or below that axis. And
Mm-hmm.
even then, there's an orb. Some astrologers use wider orbs than others. But for a setting sun that's just about to dip underneath that horizon on the descendant axis, sometimes people feel more like day charts, sometimes they feel more like night charts. I meant a freshly set sun, not a setting sun. Like the sun is just dipped below the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Since it's still going to be bright out, sometimes those charts are still treated more like a day chart than a night chart.
Yeah. I just wanted to say really quickly, like, I think a lot of people like don't have the like conception of looking at the chart visually, as it depicts literally planets being up in the sky or like below the earth and we don't see them. And I think it's like it just compares to the whole idea that just as sect has been lost from our interpretation of looking at a chart, so has like the astronomical view of understanding visually the chart and what it's saying. Like, are these planets visible? Are they up in the sky, or are they below the earth? Are they not? And so that just being the gateway into the discussion of the sect of the chart, like that it's so important to look at, like, the first thing when you see a chart for a lot of traditional astrologers is often the first question is, what's the sect of the chart? They'll just see, is it daytime? Is the sun up above the sky, or is it down below the earth? Like you said, in houses like 1 through 6. And you did also raise an important point about the whole question of the orb, or the distance between the sun and the ascendant or the descendant. So, like you said, when it's close enough, before the sunrise, it's still light out. It doesn't just go from pitch black to a bright sky. So that gives us this kind of question about, well, how much distance can there be to determine it as officially a day chart or a night chart? And there's a lot to kind of think about and say with that, because it really depends on your like lived experience with your chart after some time, if you do have your sun close to one of those angles.
Yeah, lived experience, it plays like a huge, huge role in it.
Mhm.
I have heard of other astrologers looking at the sect of other planets and like seeing if Mercury is a morning or evening star, and like just seeing which sect has more power in the
Mhm.
chart and that playing a big role in it. Other astrologers go more based off of the natives' story and their life story and their experience, like you were saying, Cam. But I also know somebody whose sun was 7 degrees below the descendant axis, and they said that they still felt like a day chart. So it really depends.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's also just an important distinction to make that like it doesn't necessarily come down to feeling more solar or lunar in that sense, because what we're really talking about is either which planets act as the most benefic or which planets act as the most malefic. So if you are someone that has your sun in a tight degree to the ascendant or the descendant, what it really means to use your lived experience means tracking transits and seeing if Mars is making more difficult things happen for you, or is it Saturn? And so, like, we talked about at the beginning, they're in different groups, and we'll explain that. But at least just as a quick intro for people who do have their sun close to the horizon, it's going to come down to kind of testing your energies and your connection to those planets and which ones are being more benefic or more malefic.
Yeah, exactly. And as you were saying, with the which planets are going to be more malefic and more benefic,
Mhm.
for a day chart, the most benefic planet is going to be Jupiter, the most malefic planet is going to be Mars. For a
Right,
night chart, the most benefic planet is going to be Venus, the most malefic planet is going to be Saturn.
right.
And the difference between a malefic Mars and a malefic Saturn should be a pretty stark difference. It's the difference between being told no versus and like not getting an experience at all versus something going like extremely just like explosively wrong, you know?
Yeah.
Uh,
For instance, if you're a day chart and you have your sun above the horizon, that means that the planets of the sect in favor or of the sect of the chart are going to be the three diurnal planets, which are the sun and Jupiter and Saturn. So in this case, the sun is the sect leader because it's the luminary. And then there's also one benefic and one malefic planet. So for the day team, the benefic is Jupiter and the malefic is Saturn. So even though Saturn is a malefic planet, because it's of the sect of the chart, because it's a diurnal chart, Saturn is on the team of the chart. So it's said to be the favored malefic or the malefic of the sect of the chart. And so in this way, Demetra George describes it as Saturn works more like a bodyguard for the native, so for your chart. So he acts more in a protective way, as opposed to a planet that is working to manifest really difficult or negative experiences for you, which in this case, for a diurnal chart, would be Mars.
Right. And then Venus would be the moderate benefic. So it might be good things that are not quite as good. It's not going to be like a solid gold brick. It might be something gilded that's just got a layer of gold around the outside.
Mm-hmm.
So keep that in mind when looking into chart interpretations for just the opposite. For a night chart, the sect leader is going to be the moon. So then you're going to have Venus and Mars, part of the nocturnal sect, the sect of the chart. And those planets are going to be working together in favor of the native. So they're going to be grouping, trying to bring to fruition things that the native is trying to achieve. So Mars might be more action based. You have more determination, whereas Saturn, instead of working like a bodyguard, Saturn's going to be saying no. Saturn might be more like a, oh, you can't get this, you haven't had this. So yeah.
And I think that kind of brings us to Mercury, because, if we're just kind of looking at these two teams so far, each team gets a sect light or the sect leader. So that's the sun for the day team and the moon for the night team. And they each get a benefic, Jupiter for the day, Venus for night, and a malefic. So Saturn for the day and Mars for the night. But where does Mercury fall, right? Because Mercury, as we've talked about so much now, is always this neutral character in astrology. And so Mercury actually will switch sect based off of what's called its solar phase. And we measure that by seeing whether Mercury is going to rise in the sky before the sun in the morning, or whether it's behind the sun and that we'll see it setting after the sun in the evening. So in that way, it's always going to be referred to as a morning star or an evening star.
And kind of like how we were saying with if you have your sun really close to that horizon of the ascendant descendant axis, let's imagine you put your sun directly on the ascendant axis. Is Mercury going to be in the 12th house? Is it going to have come out above the horizon? Is it going to reach coming out first? Is it going to reach the midheaven first? And is it going to set first? Or is it going to be following the sun? And you can kind of use that same principle with every planet, which we'll get into a little bit more later. But yeah, and that will dictate whether Mercury is diurnal or nocturnal.
Right. So yeah, I don't think we said it yet, but if it's a morning star, it joins the diurnal team, and if it's an evening star, it'll join the nocturnal team. So yeah, and I mean it's interesting because once again we're relying on the visual astronomical phenomenon of Mercury to appear early in the day, early in the morning, or late at night after the sun. And these considerations really were just not they were just totally lost through the tradition. And so looking at the solar phase is so important because it adds nuance to every planet's expression and its own gender in a way. And so this could even be a good segue to kind of talk about the gender of the planets, because that also plays a crucial role into the way that the planets are grouped in between the diurnal and nocturnal sect.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting that on both the diurnal and nocturnal team, it's the malefic that is kind of the oddball out. We have like the sect leader of the diurnal team being the sun, and then the sun is going to be hot and dry, and then Jupiter and masculine, and then Jupiter being the diurnal benefic, hot, moist, masculine. But then we have Saturn. And we've actually talked about this earlier today, but we both think that Saturn is more of a feminine planet. I know that that's controversial. And I know that a lot of authors say that Saturn is masculine, but I personally think Saturn is feminine. But then, even gender aside, Saturn is going to be cold and dry. So it's going to be oddball in that sense.
Right. And, Saturn's gender has been debated throughout the tradition because Dorotheus includes Saturn as a feminine planet. And what that ends up doing is actually making a really nice balance, looking at the planets in the sect that they're a part of, because when we think about Mars, who's the malefic of the nocturnal team, well, up until now, pretty much everything we've talked about with Mars is its relation to really masculinized energy, or energy expressed in a really active way. And so why the heck is that going to be in the feminine or the nocturnal team? And same thing with Saturn. Why is this really feminine in principle archetype? Because we in the social planets episode, we talked so much about how Saturn's a container. It makes like literally a womb for life. It makes a restriction for something to kind of come from it. And so it acts in such a yin kind of way that it really mirrors how Mars is such an active and masculine planet, but they're both in the opposite team. And I think it really connects to their temperateness, because when we think of the benefic planets, Venus and Jupiter, who are both warm and moist, that combination makes them both really moderate in the temperature of their expression. Because, okay, well, we think of Saturn, cold and dry, that's extremely, that the temperature is just way off to the extreme of coldness. And Mars being hot and dry, that's way extremely in the opposite direction of that. And so we have the benefic planets being benefic because of their temperate nature, but the malefics are malefic because they're so extreme on either end. And so by being in the opposite sect, it balances that nature out. So Saturn in the daytime is warmed up a bit, right? So that makes him a little more balanced. And then Mars at nighttime is cooled off a bit from his hot nature. So by them having really an intrinsic gender that's being expressed so extremely, by us putting them in the opposite sect, it actually keeps it really balanced out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we haven't really touched with the exaltation or dignity scheme like at all, but that's also a theme that's present there where it's not necessarily what the planet is and what the planet is familiar with, but what the planet does best with. What can the planet utilize?
Mhm. Yeah.
And when you think about a desert, and like during the day, the desert is extremely hot, it's extremely dry. And then at night, because there's no life, there's no trees, there's no moisture, the temperature plummets and it drops and it's just freezing cold and dry. And so that's that kind of like expression that you have of the malefic planets. And then
Mhm.
you go to a tropical, humid environment and you see tons of trees, tons of life, but there's no life in a desert. And so, just kind of a more tangible analogy for that.
Yeah. Yeah, no. And I think when we're talking about planets being like hot and cold, it's also just interesting that Saturn is like really the only cold planet because the sun is hot because it's the sun, right? It gives all
Hmm.
life, it gives all heat. The
Right.
moon is warm because, well, there's kind of two main reasons. One, it reflects the light of the sun, so it does emit light. There's a warm nature to the fact that it's so bright compared to all the other planets, but also it's the lowest planetary sphere and it's closest to the Earth. So different source texts would kind of write about how the Earth would release exhalations of heat off of the surface that kind of bounce up into the layer of the moon, and that the moon is like kind of helping to contain and keep some heat within like that it kind of bleeds into the lowest planetary sphere, and that those would kind of bounce back and forth a bit. So the moon was seen as warm for its light, but also its proximity to Earth. And then after that, Mars is obviously all about heat, and Jupiter and Venus are warm because they can produce life. So they have to be warm and wet. And that really only leaves us with Saturn, who is intrinsically cold, and also Mercury, who can be cold or hot. So it's interesting how the concentration of planets is mostly with hotness, and then Saturn's really the only cold one.
Yeah, yeah. And I think when you think about the nature of a cold temperature, even on like a molecular level, like think about ice and like how water changes when it's in cold. When it gets cold enough, it gets these like nice structures and they're very regimented and they're sturdier, but it's also buoyant. Ice is buoyant in its solid form. And Saturn also is buoyant. If you were to put Saturn in a massive cup of water, Saturn is less dense than water. Saturn would float. And so I just think that that's interesting to consider when thinking about the presence of this planet, not just being a part of the day sect, but also in general.
And like the combination of Mercury and Saturn both being able to be cold, I feel like really speaks to, um, like you were kind of alluding to there, like the crystalline structure that molecules kind of assume when they reach a balanced state. It's not just that it's
Mhm.
stable, but it's stable because of its geometric organization, and like it's balanced, uh, just like,
It's evenly distributed.
yeah.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
And so, in addition to the temperature of the planets being hot or cold, there's also the moisture of the planet, whether it's moist or dry. And so the planets that are moist are the moon, Venus, and Jupiter. And the planets that are dry are Mars, Saturn, and the sun. And so I think it makes sense because all of the moist planets all have to do with like life in a way. And it's also interesting that that Venus and Jupiter are both benefic planets and they're wet. And so it's like that's something that's good. Like we need water to live, to be born.
Mm-hmm.
Like it has to, like a child has to grow inside like a wet environment, like it's necessary for like the gestation of life. But then the dryness is like what kills life. And so we see Mars and Saturn being dry, and also the sun, which is interesting to think about too, because I feel like that even connects to how some people say that the sun acts like a malefic. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that that is a very interesting way to say it. I think that the sun definitely can act like a malefic. Is the sun inherently malefic? I don't think so.
Mm.
Like just at face value in a chart, even in like a night chart, I wouldn't expand that. I think that that kind of becomes a topic when you have planets under the beams or combust. But then at the same time, when a planet is cazimi, like then it's extremely powerful and it's radiating through the chart. And so
Do you want to define some of those things or?
oh, yeah, yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
Um, so under the beams, what is the degree limit for the planet? It's
So
17?
it's been debated over the tradition, but I think most most authors say under beams starts at 15, and then combustion starts a little bit closer to like 7.5 or 8 degrees away from the sun.
Yeah.
So that
Mm-hmm.
really intensifies a planet being, it's ultimately it comes down to losing visibility because the sun is so bright and its rays go out so emit so far from the sun that when a planet gets close enough, it loses sight from our perspective. So effectually in a chart, it loses power in a way. And so that happens, and the planet is said to be under the beams, or if it's close enough, like within 8 degrees of either side of the sun, then it's combust. And that's like it's really burnt up by the rays of the sun and it's really losing a lot of its power. It can also mean that the significations for the planet manifest in a hidden way or in an unseen way. So if you have a combust planet ruling the house of marriage, your marriage, well, one, you might not get married, you might struggle with relationships, or it could be like you elope, or you
Mm-hmm.
have to go about your relationships in a hidden way, or you might have an affair. So that's kind of what happens when planets are under the beams. And so we'll talk about how to apply that to different house meanings later on, but it's like they become hidden essentially.
Yeah, drowned out by the sun, and like it makes sense because the sun is so powerful and is so bright. I don't know if the sun might have more negative intentions though. Whereas like Mars, like when Mars is being malefic, like Mars wants to be malefic and has like negative intentions. Whereas
Mm.
like the sun, it might be something that happens more by accident, where it's like, oh, like I have to keep this a secret because I did A, B, and C. You know, I don't know. I don't think it's like a like you're not allowed to take this out by the sun's decree. I think it's like a do you get what I'm getting
I
at?
mean, I don't know if I totally agree though, because like earlier in the series when we talked about the sun and the notion of like being regal or royalty and how like it's kind
Hmm.
of like a king, he has the power to kind of diminish the light of the other planets that it's near. He's like, no, you can't shine brighter than me. Like I'm the king, right? So there is this like not necessarily malefic nature, but it's egotistical in a way where it's like the sun is the sole focus of the matter. And so when planets try to interfere, the sun just squashes them out. So it is kind of like a malefic in that way.
Right. I get that, but also like is the sun, is that really the attitude of the sun? Like, oh, you can't do this, or is it just like I can't help myself and like you just so happen to be caught in the crossfire? You know what I'm saying? And well, these are all things that you can also ponder yourself as you listen to this episode.
Yeah, it's not hard and fast, easy way
Yeah.
to delineate really some of this.
And it's hard to give it like a concrete answer because there are so many things that factor into the condition of a planet in a chart.
Yeah. Um, so we've pretty much talked about a lot of the conditions of the planets. I guess the other thing I would want to mention is kind of about how even though we're calling Venus and Jupiter benefic and Mars and Saturn malefic planets, based on their condition, by their sign and aspects, we're you have to keep in mind that Sect is just establishing um, really, and Demetra talks about this a good amount in her book, how Sect really establishes a baseline for the planets to function at. And then from there, there's a lot of other conditions that apply that can alter that. So if you have a malefic that's really well placed, it's going to function, it's going to be what's called a functional benefic. It's going to be working to do good things for you. But if you have a benefic that's really poorly placed, it's going to be doing just as harmful things as a malefic can do. So it's important to keep in mind that we are being like really clear cut about the intrinsic nature, but that just like everything else, you have to look at all these different criteria to assess specifically how it's going to function. So we can't just say, oh, I'm a day chart, Mars is horrible, because maybe even though Jupiter is the benefic of the team in favor, maybe it's really poorly placed and maybe your Mars is doing great and it's totally swapped. So it's important to remember that it's a baseline and there's a lot of conditions that you have to look at from there, but it's still super fundamental.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that exactly that is that this is a foundation, this is fundamental. And then there are so many ways that the planet's energy gets filtered down into our reality. And whether it's going through like a good filter and you're throwing in some sugar, making a malefic planet less malefic, or it's a benefic planet getting filtered down with some cayenne pepper and now all of a sudden it's a malefic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, always a lot to take into consideration, but definitely
Mm-hmm.
effect is pretty much a primary factor. And that's why we're talking about it now and not, the signs yet, because just understanding the planetary basis for everything, then we can start looking at zodiacal dignity from there. Because if we don't understand the baseline of how they want to operate, then it doesn't make sense to keep piling on other things when really this is the first condition that people look at in a chart and that really determines the baseline of how the planets are going to act based off the sect of the chart.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to start getting into some rejoicing conditions?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I think just one more time, we should say so the day sect, Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. The Sun is the sect leader, Jupiter is the sect benefic, Saturn is the sect malefic. For the nocturnal sect, it's going to be Moon, Venus, and Mars. Same order, leader, benefic, malefic. And then in a day chart, the strongest benefic belongs to the sect of the chart. So in a day chart, Jupiter belongs to the day sect. Jupiter is going to be the strongest benefic. The strongest malefic, the most malefic of the bunch, is going to be the one contrary to the sect of the chart. So it's going to be Mars because Mars is the malefic of a night chart. In a night chart, when you have the strongest benefic belongs to the sect of the chart, so it's going to be Venus, and then the strongest malefic is going to be contrary to the sect of the chart, so it's going to be Saturn.
mhm. Yeah, and I think one final thing to just really reiterate too is that sect isn't about strength at all. And this is something I really remember that Chris Brennan emphasized just so much, like in his book and in his course, because we're not talking about strength at all. That's a completely different question. we're just talking about quality. So it's really not about quantity. It's the qualitative analysis of, is this functioning well? Are they acting in a productive way? Or are they acting in a malefic way that's not supportive of generating beneficial outcomes for the native?
Yeah, exactly.
So that kind of brings us into looking at a couple of what are called rejoicing conditions. And basically, these are smaller modifications to looking at um, the sect of, or the sect status of the planets in a chart, I guess is how you could word it. So Demetra George in ancient astrology introduces a couple of different rejoicing conditions. So we're mainly going to be looking at hemispheres, the gender of the zodiac sign, and also the solar phase. And from there, these little minor conditions will give us a way to see if it's acting more and more in favor of its nature. So is like Jupiter acting in a more and more consistent masculine diurnal expression? And or, for instance, is Mars acting in a more continually feminine expression? We want to just see them basically be supported in these minor conditions based off of the sect that they're a part of. And that won't change for the chart. Essentially, with these rejoicing conditions, we always want to see Mars having the feminine conditions, and we always want to see Jupiter or the Sun or Saturn having consistently the masculine conditions applying to him.
Yeah. So, this is saying like, is this familiar? Is this comfortable, basically?
Yeah, it's like little modifications to the environment that the planet's in. So
Mm-hmm.
is it like, we know that Jupiter is going to be friends with Saturn because they're on the same team, but does Jupiter have these other minor conditions that are making him a little bit more disconnected from his friend Saturn, and that makes their relationship more difficult? And does that make Jupiter communicate more easily with Venus? So there's this kind of interplay here when we're looking at these that's going to let us see a little bit more about the details of the interactions in the chart.
Yeah, exactly. So for the hemispheres of a chart, it's going to be, so as we were saying earlier, we'll use a day chart for this example. So the sun is going to be in the upper hemisphere, the solar hemisphere, the solar sector. Those are terms that you'll both hear used. And that's going to be in a day chart, the top half of the chart. And so you're going to be asking the question, is this planet diurnal? Is it in the day sector? Is this planet nocturnal? Is it in the nocturnal sector?
Mhm.
So it's a matter of, in this moment, in the moment when your birth was captured, these are no longer just traits inherent in the planets anymore and groupings of them anymore. When in the moment when you were born, was this planet in the hemisphere that it prefers?
Yep. And so another thing just about the power of the sun, and I think we mentioned that in the luminary episode, but because the sun just simply just determines the sect of the chart on its own, same thing with determining which one is the solar hemisphere. So this is where some people might get confused, because in a case of a night chart, when the sun is below the horizon, that makes the solar hemisphere, aka where the sun is, on the bottom half of the chart, which is kind of flipped to what we would think of, because it's daytime up above and night below. But in a night chart, the solar hemisphere is below and the nocturnal hemisphere is above. So we don't want to necessarily say the lunar hemisphere, because the moon moves around the whole zodiac much quicker than the sun. So in some cases, the moon will be right near the sun in the solar hemisphere. And so to kind of explain what that means for this condition is, well, that's going to be bad, right? Because we want the moon to be in the nocturnal hemisphere. Same thing with Mars and Venus.
Right. And this has to do with where the planets were when you were born. So if you were to be standing outside and looking up, is it going to be the sun in the sky? Or is it going to be a dark night sky?
Mhm.
Or is that dark night sky going to be below your feet in the bottom half? Is it below the horizon?
Mhm.
So, thinking about the chart as the physical world around us can also help kind of conceptualize that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is worth mentioning that Chris Brennan says that hemispheres specifically, he does not regard them like to a very high power. He says that the original considerations of sect are more important. Did you say that he felt similarly with sign and phase, that these were
Um,
just very minor?
in his book in the chapter on sect, I don't know if he incorporated solar phase as a rejoicing condition for every planet. He talked about it in relation to Mercury because that's important to figure out which sect Mercury is on. But he didn't discuss it as like any old condition for any planet. He just talked about I think just the hemisphere and the gender of the zodiac sign that the planet's located in. Um, but yeah, so like we said at the beginning, these are conditions. So the primary factor here is the sect team, is it in the team in favor or is it not? Other than that, we just have these minor little kind of tweaking measures to or tweaking tools to measure is it's on the team, but is it happy on the team or is it getting pulled to like feeling like it wants to be in the other team? um or is it just following its nature naturally and that's adding to its beneficence? That's really what these conditions are for.
Yeah, exactly. And then, did you want to move into zodiacal sign?
I was just going to say maybe for the hemispheres just to spell it out really clearly, like, okay, so if you're a day chart, that means the sun's up above, so you also want to find Jupiter and Saturn up there. They will all like get a point in a way. There wasn't
Mm-hmm.
a specific way of counting, but we're just saying, for example, and then that means that we want to see the moon, Venus, and Mars in the other hemisphere, so below the ascendant axis. And then Mercury, based off of his solar phase, will want to be either up with the sun or in the opposite team. Now, that's where, at least for the question of hemispheres, it can get a little tricky for Mercury and Venus in particular, because those two planets are kind of tethered to the sun. So they never really move far enough away from the sun where they can be in like the other hemisphere for a long time, because Mercury will only move around 28 degrees away from the sun at the maximum elongation. So there's only a couple times of the year where there's that much separation between Mercury and the sun. And, on top of that, that there's enough time for the sun to set and for it to like really officially be a night chart. And then for Mercury to still be up there. So that limits Mercury to rejoicing by hemisphere to a really small amount of charts. And even the same thing for Venus, because she will move up to 48 degrees away, but that's once again still really limited because her maximum elongation, she doesn't get to 48 degrees away as often as Mercury does, because Mercury will make 3 retrograde cycles a year, which means it'll reach that elongation point and turn back. But Venus is much less often. So Venus is even rarer in some cases to really find her rejoicing by hemisphere in a chart,
Yeah, yeah,
because the thing with her is, at least Mercury, half of the time he'll be a morning star, and that means he'll want to be near the sun, so it doesn't matter anyway. But Venus is always a nocturnal planet, and she's always tied to the sun. So that means that there's always way more people that have Venus not happy by hemisphere, as opposed to Mercury.
yeah. That is very true. That is very true.
And I think Demetra even has a line in her book where she says like that's maybe why so many people struggle with relationships and marriage, is just because Venus is stuck to the sun and that's not her nature. So that's also just something funny to think about too.
Yeah, that is food for thought for sure. Yes, shout out to Demetra
I know.
for, yeah, everything she's done. And Demetra's work has played a role in this episode as the listeners have
Yeah,
gathered.
for sure. I
Yeah.
of course want to credit Demetra and Chris too for all the work
Yes,
they've done to revive and spread a lot of the knowledge here.
absolutely. Us and many other astrologers are very grateful.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the next rejoicing condition?
Yeah, definitely. So this one is going to be whether or not the planet is rejoicing by zodiacal sign. Or polarity is another way to portray it. So there are masculine and feminine signs, and diurnal planets are going to prefer the masculine signs, which are going to be all of the fire and air signs in the zodiac. So every fire sign, every air sign is going to be inherently masculine. The nocturnal planets are going to prefer the feminine signs. So there's going to be water and earth signs. And so Jupiter is going to prefer Leo to say, I don't know,
Capricorn.
Capricorn,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Or anything earth
Yeah, anything earth.
or water.
Exactly.
Well,
Right.
it's funny because
Cancer.
I know
Yeah.
that's why, well,
Mhm.
we're not even gonna, they want to be in, diurnal planets want to be fire, air, feminine,
Noc
nocturnal planets want to be in water or earth.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. If you know whether one planet, I mean, one sign is feminine in the zodiac, you're just going to alternate. If one sign is feminine, the next sign is masculine, and so
Yeah.
on and so
Yeah, like
forth.
you can count through. So like all of the odd numbered signs are masculine and all the even numbers are feminine because it'll always go fire, earth, air, water. So it always alternates gender or polarity going to the next sign.
Yes, exactly. And then, so, I mean, that one's pretty simple. They just
Mhm.
want to be with whichever polarity they prefer.
Yep,
And then, did you want to welcome us into solar phase?
sure. And yeah, this isn't too different from what we've already talked about because this is the same idea of looking at how we assessed whether Mercury was on the diurnal team or the nocturnal team based off of, like I mentioned, the solar phase. So we can look at that for all of the planets. And the easiest way to do this is look at your chart. It's best if you can like have a phone or something printed out to hold it physically and just in your hands rotate it so that you imagine the sun is right on the ascendant degree. So if you imagine in your chart that the sun is right on the horizon, which planets are above it, which planets essentially have risen before the sun, or if you want to look at it and put it on the descendant, which planets are behind it and which planets are setting after the sun in the evening. So this is how you look at whether a planet is morning rising or a morning star versus being evening setting or an evening star.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, and so like we said before, the morning star, the diurnal planets want to rejoice as morning stars and the nocturnal planets want to rejoice as evening stars.
Yeah. And so these are just extra layers of comfort and familiarity for
Mhm.
these planets.
Yeah.
This is not going to be the same as like exaltation or anything like that. This is specifically for the sect of the planets and different conditions that they are accustomed to and would prefer.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really just I think about comfortability. They
Hmm.
feel like they're in their own skin in a way, or
Right.
they feel like they're an outsider.
Right. Like if I can't have my domicile, can I at least have a sign that is also masculine? Like
Right.
that kind of energy.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be in a feminine sign and I'm a masculine planet,
Hmm.
I at least be in the sector that I prefer? Can I at least be in the solar hemisphere?
Yeah.
I kind of picture that energy.
Yeah. And I actually had a crazy reading last week with a client who had most of their planets in all of the opposite rejoicing conditions. So I'm pretty sure almost all the nocturnal planets, which included Mercury in their chart, so they had four nocturnal planets, they were, I think, all in the opposite conditions. So they were all in the solar hemisphere, they were all in masculine signs, and they were all morning stars. And so when a planet is debilitated by all of the rejoicing conditions, it's said to be ex condita, which is like out of its condition or completely out of its nature. So even though they're all the nocturnal team, they're all being pushed by the three other main factors of assessing like their gender slash their sect condition. They're all in like the most debilitated position. And what ended up happening is this person's body actually produced too much testosterone, and they were developing health problems because their body was physically not producing enough estrogen.
That is very fascinating.
Yeah.
And I
No.
mean, even just with the idea of like masculine versus feminine
Mhm.
and having all of the feminine, I mean, having all of the nocturnal, which are more feminine planets, being in diurnal signs and being in masculine signs, and all of these like diurnal conditions producing more testosterone, which is like a masculine thing, and then like not enough estrogen. That is very fascinating, very literal.
Exactly. It's really literal. And so that really opens up a whole debate about, gender in astrology, because this could be a really good way to analyze, um, and think about how you express yourself. If you're a day chart, but your sun is in a feminine sign, and or I guess using the sun is a bad example, but ready, let's say you're a night chart and your moon is near the sun, so in the solar hemisphere, and it's in like a fiery masculine sign like Sagittarius, and then on top of that, if it's rising before the sun as a morning star, it's ex condita, so it's outside of all of its preferred conditions, and that could in a way create some kind of dysphoric or confusing connection between your gender and how you express yourself too. So kind of looking at all of your planets sect conditions could be a gateway into seeing why you might feel like a stronger why you might feel like you possess or exhibit more masculine or feminine energies in your personality.
And you might be able to recognize that dissonance too, and see how others' expectations of you factor into that too. How
Mhm.
sometimes it can be others and how you are treated by others and stuff like that. So it's very applicable, although there's lots of fine details, and although they might not be the most weighty things in the chart, they're still very relevant and you can recognize them.
Mhm. And also, like, so on the opposite spectrum of a planet being ex-condita, we can also look at like a condition for when planets are doing really well by all these rejoicing conditions. And so a planet, so for medieval astrology, we have two different terms for a planet that's rejoicing. One of them is being in highs or highs, and this is essentially if it's of the sect in favor. So planets can only be in highs if they're in the sect in favor. So if you're a day chart, first of all, only the sun, Jupiter, Saturn can be in highs, or Mercury if he's a morning star. If you're a night chart, only the moon, Venus, or Mars could be in highs. But then to be in highs, it has to be of the sect in favor and um, be in its preferred hemisphere. So for instance, if it's a night chart and you have the moon opposite the sun, your moon is in highs because it's the sect in favor and opposite the sun. If you're a day chart with Jupiter one sign away from the sun and they're both up in the sky, then Jupiter is in highs. Now, if a planet's also in the zodiacal sign of its preferred gender, then it's in halb, which is just an additional condition that intensifies itself and expressing its nature in the most comfortable way that it wants to.
Yeah, and we keep coming back to this word comfort, and that's really what it boils down to. Is
Mm,
just, is this planet comfortable?
right.
And like with Mars specifically, the malefics specifically, but Mars in particular makes me think of like If Mars is uncomfortable, if Mars is not where Mars wants to be, and it's the malefic contrary to sect, so you're a day chart, Mars is going to be your malefic contrary to sect. Um, is Mars going to be throwing a temper tantrum? Is Mars going to be just like ravaging that area of life because it's not happy?
Mhm.
Like, I do not want to be here. I'm going to burn this place to the ground, is kind of the energy that Mars gives. And then Saturn being like, I do not want to be here. You're never going to have love. Like that kind of energy, not as extreme, but like you get what I'm saying. Just like this, like, I don't like this. I don't want this. I don't want to be here. I don't like this energy around me.
Yeah.
And that can kind of come up with the areas of life in your chart.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we covered most of our bases for the for what I had here. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about.
We covered it all. Everything that I had to say, even towards the end, I felt like we were kind of running out a little bit.
Nice.
Because I
Yeah, well,
mean, yeah, this isn't a super complex topic. It's just one of the technical things.
mhm. But really important because like sitting and looking at your planet's sect conditions can explain a lot,
Yeah. Yeah. And
especially with,
especially
no, you go.
especially if you don't know that like malefic will become more malefic depending on like the condition or like just which malefic tends to have more abrasive tendencies in your life. If
Yeah.
you didn't know about that and sect, like that like will blow your mind as it
Mhm.
does like everyone who learns about it for the first time.
Yeah.
And it also explains why some people say that that Mars is definitely a malefic and other people don't feel like that a lot at all. Same with Saturn.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some people that have just followed astrology and, kind of feel like they have a relationship to the planets in their chart or by transits have an understanding of how they work with them. And, maybe you find out you're a day chart and that Mars is an evil planet, supposedly, but you thought all along that it wasn't that bad. Well, it also brings in this idea of, first of all, having to validate and honor our lived experience with astrology and be able to say, well, this is what I've lived with. And so even though the textual tradition supports this, that I have to validate what I've experienced with it, but also that we do have to be looking at some of the specific details that can indicate why that relationship might be better or worse. Because when we look at these rejoicing conditions and you get into it, at a base level, yeah, maybe Mars is the out of sect malefic, but maybe it's in highs or in halb and it's really comfortable where it is. So there's always a lot of things to take into account. But I think this is a really important gateway into just getting a baseline idea for the happiness level of your planets, basically. You know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All
Yeah.
right. Well, this was a pretty good episode.
Yeah,
Pretty laid back.
I had a good time
Mm-hmm.
talking with you about this too. I felt like there was like not as much to say as other times, but there was some like technical meat that I felt like we got through it pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. And it was meat that had to be eaten because we've said it literally every single
I
episode.
know, definitely chew this meat for a little while because it's gonna come up. We're always gonna
Yes.
reference planets kind of based off of these sect conditions. We'll talk about morning and evening stars. We'll talk about um and sign genders too. Hemisphere we might not come up as much, but also always sect, always the baseline stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Alrighty. Well, thank you guys for tuning in today. My name is Stella.
Yep. My name's Cam, and we'll see you guys next week.
Yep. Mercuranians
Opinions
out.
out. Happy
Happy
stargazing, guys.
stargazing.
Bye.